Welcome to episode 36 of the Life and Mission Podcast. This week, my guest is Mackenzie Ryan of Faith Storytellers. If you have a story to tell, this podcast is for you. My guest today is Mackenzie Ryan, and Mackenzie, you are a journalist, and you are a journalist with a very special kind of mission. Tell us a little bit about yourself and, what you're doing and where you came from and then what you're doing now, ending up with the Faith Storytellers.
Great. Thanks for having me, Kay. So I was a journalist for 15 years. I worked in 5 different states throughout the country: Minnesota, Oregon, Maryland, Florida, and then Iowa, which is where I now live.
All right.
Home. And I just grew up learning how to tell stories from sitting around the table with my grandparents and parents, listening to the stories, and then professionally telling stories of others through newspapers and then eventually TV, radio, live events, and other series. And so I was sort of in this point of transition after 15 years where I was thinking and praying about what was next for me. And my pastor invited me to start teaching a storytelling class at my church that turned into Faith Storytellers, which is what we're talking about here today. And through this process, I created free resources and created an online community really dedicated to lifting up and sharing the story God is writing in the world, first-person stories of faith. Now, I no longer work as a journalist. I now own my own marketing and PR company, but the storytelling model that I teach churches and small groups and believers to follow is the same work that I'm doing with businesses and nonprofits and personal brands. It's just in a secular way. And so if you go to faithstorytellers.com, you can find resources, you can read stories of others, and we really encourage and provide that equipping resource to say, how do I tell a true first-person story about my belief in God in a way that can be received by others in whatever format that you need it to.
And what does that look like in your, I know I just stumbled upon what you were doing through a group that we're on in Facebook. And it's really cool because there's people that you don't normally hear from, and you get these really nice stories from them.
Yeah, so it's sort of multifaceted. So we provide free resources on our website at faithstorytellers.com that's been used for church groups, small groups, Bible studies. We're partnering with a number of local groups like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes is going to be using some of our resources. We've been invited into a local prison to help prisoners share a story that is hopeful and inspiring, potentially sharing a story of gratitude. We share stories weekly on our newsletter. It's really designed as an email magazine called Faith Stories Weekly, and you can sign up for that at faithstorytellers.com. And it's really just designed as a community in which we're sharing first-person stories of our faith.
So what does that process look like? I mean, you're a journalist and you're trained in how to tell stories and how to find stories, how to handle stories, but you're usually, as a journalist, you are telling other people's stories, but now you're going in and you're helping people tell their own stories. So what does that process look like?
Yeah, so we have a 7-step guide to faith storytelling on our website that you can download at faithstorytellers.com. And that's going to walk you through a very structured, prescriptive approach to telling a story. And I do that in part because as a journalist, I learned structure of how do you put a story, sometimes a really big story with lots of emotions or a lot of action or a lot of whatever, into a short format that's digestible for people to read or to connect with in that way. So if you download that resource, we've had small groups go through that in about an hour. And it really starts with praying and asking God, what story do you want me to share? We all have many stories. Some are sort of mustard seed stories. There's these like tiny moments. And then some of them are really big, heavy stories. There are testimonial stories. There are stories of passing down our faith. There's just a million different types of stories that we can share. And the process really says, okay, let's choose one, and then let's anchor it in God's truth. So the second step is really choosing a value or a verse that you can say, this is what my story is about, so that we know we're sharing truth when we share our story. And then we structure it. So then it's saying, okay, let's put it into a storytelling format like a movie where there's a beginning, a middle, and an ending that brings resolution. And we always ask folks to answer the question at the end, which I believe is the most important part of a story, with the sentence, what do I know to be true about God that I didn't before? So there's sort of a structure and a process we bring people through, and we're really encouraging them to tell a story about their relationship with God, not just a relationship with somebody else, another person, but how did your relationship with God grow deeper as you experienced the story that you lived?
And structure, I think, you talked about beginning, middle, end. And so that's what I love about it, is that you're bringing that training in, because I believe, and it's part of why I started this podcast, is that everybody does have a story to tell, but we don't always know how to tell this story. And so it comes out jumbled, and it's got all these rabbit trails and all of these things. And so putting that structure to it really helps us put things out there in a way that other people can receive it, because I think that's the part sometimes that we're missing, is I do have a story, but I feel like it's not being received. And sometimes it's because of the way, there's no structure around it that makes it receivable. It's kind of like you don't just give somebody water, you give it to them in a glass. You have to put it in something to deliver it.
We have used this structure at my church. And what I have found in those workshops is that people tend to come in with two misconceptions. Mm-hmm. One is that they don't have a story. And I don't believe that's true. I believe everybody has a story. We all have many stories. If you think about the Bible, there's stories within a story. They have a beginning with Genesis, an ending with Revelations, and then you have this pinnacle moment where Jesus is resurrected and comes back. But think of all of the chapters and the verses, and sometimes even a story of just one or two sentences within that Bible. And our lives are the same way. We might have this powerful story of being converted, or we might have a small, tiny mustard seed. Just today, a prayer was answered. And that's a story that God has written in my life. So that's one of the big misconceptions, is I don't have a story to tell. Well, I am here to tell you, you do. You have many stories to choose from. Yes. The second misconception is that the story is so overwhelming that I can't possibly tell it. Mm-hmm. And especially when you're dealing with trauma or abuse or hardships, anything like that, I absolutely understand that. It can just feel so big and weigh you down. And storytelling isn't counseling. So we often say, if you've never told a story before to someone, go seek out a pastor or a counselor or someone who you can process that story with in a really safe, private environment.
Yes.
But after you've gone through that, then it's just a matter of whittling it down into a structure where you can share it in just a few words and finding the right words for you to share it with.
So what are in the actual telling of the stories, what are some of the big challenges that people have once they actually realize, okay, I do have a story, and I start to share it, but what are some of the hurdles then?
We bring them through 3 steps. So it's very similar to a sculpture. That's the metaphor we like to use. So let's say you have all of this clay, and the clay is the material from your life. So you might start with a big block of clay, and then now you need to whittle it into a shape. Now, are you going to choose to, do a sculpture of a little boy or an old man or a teenager? You have to choose that point in time. But after that, then you have to start the heavy lifting of taking that clay and whittling out the head and the shoulders. And the opposite can be true. People might look at that blank slate and say, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to build a story? Well, you have the material in the clay, but you have to start building it on and starting to form that head and shoulders. And so that's really the heavy lifting of storytelling. And then from there, we sort of refine it over time. So the next step would be, once you have the head and shoulders, which is sort of the beginning, middle, and ending, then you start deciding what scenes do you want to share. So if you think about the ears and the eyes, these are the sort of unique details that really bring a story to life. Who was there? What was happening? The emotion in the room, the descriptions, those type of things that kind of set the scene, so to speak. And then the next step would be sort of a polishing phase, where you are going to be doing the cheekbones or the hairline, sort of these little tiny details that can make a big difference. We often suggest that folks look for these divine details. These are these details that are just very, very powerful, but oftentimes very small. Mm-hmm. And I can circle back to that in a minute. And then the last step is really polishing it. So now you're sort of prepared, you're ready to share it. How do you want to share it? I believe that we are wired to share stories in many forms. It could be writing, it could be conversation. And so just praying through, okay, now I have my story sort of in a format that can be shared. How will I share that?
So you just talked about those small details. So tell us more about that.
Oh, it's amazing. This is probably my favorite part of the process. So we always ask folks, especially when we're able to spend more time with them, for them to ask and pray for these divine details. And these are these tiny, tiny details that I believe God puts into our lives to say, hey, my fingerprints are all over this. There was a woman that came through our class named Abby Catman. You can read her story at abbycatman.com. She's an amazing writer, but she has lived through some weird stuff. She was part of a family that was racked with addiction. And when she was born, was in a car accident that her two younger sisters and the other driver. Just a horrible, horrible sadness and grief, and just so tragic. And it just wrecked her as a young woman. And she grew up having to deal with that and asking God about it. And as an adult, 20 years later, I think she's in her 30s now, she went through this forgiveness process where she reconciled. She actually reached out and found the widow, the Good Samaritan, and the sheriff's deputy who all responded to the accident. And they all came together. I know, it is such an amazing story of forgiveness and grace. And they all said, wow, I have found some sort of healing. Thank you for connecting us again. So she came into my class wanting to share that story. Now that is a big story.
Yes, it is.
And we were going through this process, and then we were saying, okay, where are these divine details? Well, she realized that the song that came on the radio at just the right moment, at just the period of time that she needed it to, those types of songs? Well, the song has a hymn in it, and it was the same hymn that was sung at her mother's funeral.
Oh, wow.
And so that's the kind of divine detail that people find all the time when they really dig into their story.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So I guess you have a lot of kind of light bulb moments where people realize something that was there.
Yeah.
But as they really start to look closely at their story, like you said, there's God's fingerprints. And when you find that, what happens in a person in that process of writing their story as they find those fingerprints?
So the fingerprint moments are those aha moments. I mean, to go through this whole process and that heavy lifting can be challenging, and there's roadblocks, and there can be resistance to doing it. But the folks who sort of persevere through, and we try to do this in community because it's easier to do it in community and persevere through together, they just find this lightness, and they find God. They grow deeper in their relationship with God. And that's really the ultimate goal of this is, Abby can say, wow, he really was there. And I have this tangible fingerprint to show it. And I have shared that story multiple times. And I actually shared it with a former colleague of mine at the Des Moines Register, and they wrote about her story on the Thanksgiving Day paper.
Oh, wow.
And it's just been an amazing story of grace and forgiveness that has really empowered our community here in Iowa. And I have heard so many people just say, thank you, Abby, for sharing that story. Thank you for those little moments of, I don't see it right now because I'm in it. But one day when I look back, I think I can.
Yeah. Wow. So the sharing of the story is helping other people who may be not as far along in their own stories, and it gives hope. And I think hope is essential in life. Really.
It is. I absolutely believe that.
And you mentioned community, the power of telling story in the community. I also was looking at some of the faith stories that you have shared online, and there was one where it was a fellow journalist, and he had a daughter, and he shared her baptism, shared the baptism with the community, and it brought the community together.
It did.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So Tim Walters is a former colleague of mine. I used to live in Florida. I live in Iowa now. But when I was there, he is just a very bold, although he wouldn't use that word, pragmatic person. And he just loved to share with the community. And so when his daughter Isabella was born, he started writing this column. And it was really about, parenting and being a dad and sort of the ups and downs of that. And as part of that process, he talked about his faith. He's Catholic. His Catholicism is really important to him, and he wanted to share that with his daughter. And in sharing that with his daughter, he also wanted to share that with the community. And he decided to invite the whole community, Brevard County, to his daughter's baptism. And a number of people, non-Catholics, non-Christians, showed up because they had gotten to know Isabella through the column, and they had gotten to know him. And he was sharing things that were, I guess you would say typical of a parenting column, but also more vulnerable moments and struggles he had. And so by sharing and telling those stories, he had built a relationship, and that relationship built a community, and then he invited that community. And so in talking with him and hearing how that story transpired, I think it really did bring that community together, and it just showed the power of an invitation after you've built a relationship.
Yes. And that including others in your story is such an important part. But it's a very difficult part. Like you said, it's very vulnerable to put yourself out there, especially with people that you don't really know. And I remember as I read this story, there was a line in there about it was almost like a community of grandparents for Isabel at some point, because there was more to the story than the baptism. I would encourage people to go to your site, and read more about that. But it was more than that one moment, that there was this sense of community, and it's just huge. Talk about more about that, and then also about the power of community in actually helping us to tell our stories.
Sure. So I really believe that a story sparks a conversation. So when you share a story, especially a first person story, because you're not using the word you or the word we, it's first person. So you're using I, me, mine, my, and you're saying, here, this is what I believe. This is what I know to be true. But you're creating that emotional space for someone who might not believe or who have different beliefs about the denomination or whatever you're talking about, to say, okay, instead of pushing against me and telling me what to believe, I'm curious and I want to know more. So really the goal of first person storytelling is to help people share in a way that creates emotional space so it can be given, almost like a gift. I'm giving you this story and then I'm letting it go, and you are picking up that story and receiving it. It's an exchange. And then the story, I believe, is really the spark of a conversation. And so then potentially after sharing that story, you would have the opportunity to have a conversation. And that conversation can build a relationship. And I think that's what we saw with Tim, is he was giving a story in first person, and people were receiving it. Not everybody, but people who were open were receiving it. And then they were sort of building that conversation within the community, and people would email him and he would write about the emails or ask questions. I mean, it really was this two-way street, as any good columnist would have, or any good blogger or writer would have. They're engaged in a community with their audience. And then through that community and that relationship created the opportunity for an invitation. And I think that that's what we've seen. And I think that happens every day. It might not be as public with a newspaper, but if you think about your friend at work or your girlfriend, in the carpool line or whatever it is, having a story that sparks a conversation that leads to community creates the basis for that invitation.
Yeah, that's great. And it is that sharing. You mentioned that, he got emails from readers and things, and there's almost this impulse to, if you share your story with me, it really makes me want to then also share part of my story with you.
Right.
And so it is this reciprocal sharing, and it creates bonds. We can connect over those stories. And
the important thing to remember is that when you give a story, it's a gift, but when somebody gives you their story, it's a gift as well. And they might not believe the same things. And so I have been I've had friendships form where I have shared my faith through a first person story. And then they shared their beliefs and it's not the same. And they might not believe in the same God. And just in my world, what I really try to do is just create that connection and that relationship, knowing that I'm not trying to convert them. I believe the Holy Spirit does the converting. But we're just building that relationship, building those connections in that community, and an invitation naturally forms typically out of that. And I think that's okay. There's so much pressure on, individuals in the evangelism space. Why don't we just have relationships and share stories and create the kind of synergy that allows the Holy Spirit to move?
Yeah, and it's true, of evangelism. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, of Jesus and the disciples. There were times when he taught, and a lot of times we say discipleship, and it's kind of in a class. It's come to this class, take this course, read this book, do this Bible study. And it seems like so much work, but the real discipleship, think about Jesus, how much discipleship was done as they walked, between the towns where these different things happened. Look at the discipleship that happened, on the boat on their way across, the little lessons, the little comments, the little things. When you are walking alongside with someone and living life with them in community, and it's really community where the discipleship takes place.
I think so. It's just so powerful. And so I just encourage folks to share stories and, when appropriate, share your faith. Sometimes it's just sharing a value. So sometimes I'm in I run a secular business. We work with secular companies through marketing and PR. But I encourage folks to share their values. Maybe it's a story about gratitude, or a story about love, or a story about community, or, goodness. And so there are ways to share your story in different contexts and still allow that Holy Spirit to move.
Yes. What is the change that you see in a person as they begin to tell their story?
Oh, it's amazing. It's just amazing. For a lot of times, it's almost like flipping a page into a new chapter. So if someone has been burdened by their story, they are able to write it down or share it. And it's almost like they are able to look back and say, okay, that's how God was working in my life. That's how I got to know God, and our relationship grew deeper. And then it's almost like a weight is lifted and they're ready to move on to that next chapter in their life. And so there's so much power and healing that can come. Now, the first part, if you've been through trauma or abuse or hardship, is to get that professional support. I am not a counselor. I do not teach therapy or how to do therapy. And that's really the first step, is to work through those details in a really safe, confidential space.
Yes.
Sometimes people have come to me and say, I've never told this story before in my whole life. And I say, ooh, I don't know if this is the place. Because it isn't that sacred, holy healing spot.
Right.
And then when people come into the class, a lot of times I'm saying, you don't have to tell the details. You don't need to tend, darkness happens, but we're not going to dwell there. So why don't you tell that hard, hurt, that hang up, that moment that was so devastating in the form of a metaphor. And so that helps people shift their thinking about their story, and helps them process through it. So a common metaphor, I live in the Midwest, so there's tornadoes here, is, let's say, all of a sudden it felt like a tornado wrecked my life. It just came out of the blue and left devastation and carnage in its wake. And all of a sudden I was, hunkered down in the basement and wondering if I would ever get through this alive. And then suddenly there was quiet and I heard a bird sing. And in that moment when I walked outside and I saw the rubble, but I also saw sunlight, and I just knew that I was going to be okay. And I believe God had gotten me through this. And so you're not sharing the terrible, terrible details that absolutely happen. If something happened to you that is hard, abuse or trauma, it's real. It is part of your story. But I am saying that I believe you don't need to be burdened by it.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of your story, and you can share it in a way that can be received by others and help you move through to that new chapter.
Mm-hmm. Mackenzie, is this something that anybody can do? I mean, you have a guide, right?
Absolutely. Because we are always looking for individuals who want to share their story. And we ask folks to follow that very specific format we talked about, with the clear beginning, middle, and ending,
Mm-hmm.
with that last sentence being, what do I know to be true about God that I didn't before? And if you download the 7-step guide to faith storytelling, it will walk you through that process that we just talked about. And I would really encourage you to write that story.
Mm-hmm.
We have a submission process, and submit it. We typically ask for just 3 paragraphs to just really structure your story in a very short way.
Yep.
The first paragraph being the middle, the second being the middle, or I'm sorry, the first paragraph being in the beginning, the second paragraph being the middle, and the third paragraph being the ending. And then if you submit it through our online form, we'll take a look at it, we'll offer some suggestions, and then consider it for publication, at which point we'll ask you to submit a longer story, typically between 500 and 1,000 words. So it's not a huge story at all. It's just a short story. You can read it in a few minutes. That's sort of the ideal length our audience has told us,
Mm-hmm.
that they can read it in their email, between meetings or on lunch or whatnot. And really the goal is just to share what we know to be true about God. So if somebody is going through a hardship or a struggle, they might not be able to see, because God is just so close to them. It's almost like he's just so close to you, you can't see him. You're in a fog and he's so close. But once you get some distance and you can look back, you're like, oh, that's where he was. That's how he was working in my life.
Yes.
And just think of the impact you could have by sharing your story.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened that 5, 10, 20 years ago with someone who is going through the same thing right now.
Yes. And that's why sharing our stories is so powerful and so important. Mackenzie, thank you so much for doing what you do. It's very powerful, and I really hope that if you're listening and you go to Mackenzie's site, if you go to faithstorytellers.com and you do your story, if you go through that process and if you share that story with Mackenzie, let me know. Let us know here at Life and Mission, and because we want to celebrate that with you. It's a brave step, and it's an exciting step, and it's a powerful step. So, Mackenzie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kay.
That's all for this week on the Life and Mission podcast. Find your voice, tell your story, change the world.